Good morning and welcome to today's daily reflection. Now, many of us look at the Old Testament and that's it. We just look and then return to the much more familiar New Testament. But I think we can still learn from many of the Old Testament stories. For example, we all know the story of the prodigal son. Today's set reading from the Old Testament tells the story of what you could call, or who you could call, the prodigal king. It tells the story of Manasseh, who was the son of Hezekiah, who was one of the few kings that followed David that history tells us could be considered to have been a good king, as most seem to fit the description of bad or evil. Hezekiah had been responsible for a spiritual revival during his reign that swept the entire nation. He had managed to do away with the idolatry that his father Ahaz had established. He had purged the nation of apostasy, turning the nation back to God. Today's reading is taken from 2 Chronicles, chapter 33. The first 6 verses set the scene. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years. But he did what was evil in the Lord's sight, following the detestable practices of the pagan nations that the Lord had driven away from the land ahead of the Israelites. He rebuilt the pagan shrines his father Hezekiah had broken down. He constructed altars for the images of Baal and set up Asherah poles. He also bowed down before the powers of the heavens and worshipped them. He built pagan altars in the temple of the Lord, the place where the Lord had said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." He built these altars for the powers of the heavens in both courtyards of the Lord's temple. Manasseh also sacrificed his own sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He practiced sorcery, divination and witchcraft, and he consulted with mediums and psychics. He did much that was evil in the Lord's sight, arousing his anger. In other words, Manasseh worshipped everything he could except God. Not only did he turn away from God, but he caused his nation to do likewise. Manasseh came to the throne when he was 12 years old, reigning for about 10 years as co-regent with his father. But on his father's death, he became worse, even than the pagans who lived in the neighbouring nations. He seduced the people into idolatry, destroying all his father's good work, using astrology, spiritism, wizardry, and even human sacrifice, even sacrificing his own sons. The story of Manasseh is also told in the book of Kings. It tells there how Manasseh started out sinful and died sinful, wicked, and totally unrepentant. The book of Kings was compiled during Israel's captivity in Babylon, while asking the question, how did we get here, after their land had been decimated, and their cultural identity had been uprooted and transported to Babylon. Many read into this story that his crimes were so heinous that they sealed the fate of Israel when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and took the population into exile in Babylon. Here was a man, a king who reigned longer than any other king in the history of Israel, who thumbed his nose at God for 50-odd years, yet who died at a ripe old age in his own bed in peace. He was probably the most wicked king in Israel's history, yet God did nothing in all those years. How, you might ask, can someone live that way and seemingly get away with it? But these verses in Chronicles, written much later than the story in Kings, tells of Manasseh taken captive to Babylon, repenting, and then returning to Jerusalem. The following verses of chapter 33 continue with, "The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they ignored all his warnings. So the Lord sent the commanders of the Assyrian armies, and they took Manasseh prisoner. They put a ring through his nose and bound him in bronze chains and led him away to Babylon. But while in deep distress, Manasseh sought the Lord his God and sincerely humbled himself before the God of his ancestors. And when he prayed, the Lord listened to him and was moved by his request. So the Lord brought Manasseh back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. then Manasseh finally realized the Lord alone is God. It was here in that dungeon that he finally hit rock bottom, humbled himself and turned to God. His problem hadn't been his circumstances, as he had every advantage. His problem was his own rebellious heart. But here, in that dungeon, he finally came to the place where he was finally willing to submit his heart to God. On his release from captivity, he then started to undo all the evil things he had done. He took away all the foreign gods and idols that he had put in the temple in Jerusalem. All the altars were removed and dumped unceremoniously outside the city. But despite all of his wickedness, Manasseh is on the list of Jesus' ancestors listed in the Gospel of Matthew. And it is interesting to note that many of those names and dates in the story are corroborated by recent archaeological findings. 2,000 years later, we all know the story of the man guilty of selling Africans into slavery. The irreverent, foul-mouthed John Newton, who began his life at sea as a deserting sailor, then became a slave and finally a slave trader who shamelessly transported kidnapped Africans across the Atlantic in the bowels of his ship. But no matter who we are, we should never forget the words written in the New Testament. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So there's only one way I can think of to finish this reflection. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. I was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Well, whatever you do today into this coming week, with a smile, this weather, everything will seem better than it might well be, no matter where we find ourselves today. Goodbye for now.